It's fast. Very, very striking. One of the most iconic engines Lionel made in the late 90s. Did I say 90s? Oh boy, I'm gonna finally date myself in a video, aren't I? How's it going, everybody? This is Matt from mattyctrain. Welcome back to the railroad. I hope you guys are doing well, and I'm hoping you guys are starting to enjoy the holiday season as much as I have been. And as you guys know, this is the time of year where it's train season. This is the best time of the year when all the new products from Lionel or MTH or any of the manufacturers have their releases that they announced earlier in the previous year, and everything just kind of starts piling in and coming in all at once. It's a really exciting and fun time for the hobby, and it's just always fun to run trains this time of year. There's just something about the magic of Christmas or the holidays in general and model trains. They just always go hand in hand. I don't know what it is, but it's always just a blast this time of year. To really and truly indulge and enjoy this great hobby that we all share. And today, we're not necessarily talking about something brand new. We're talking about something very old and something I have been wanting in my collection for several years for multiple reasons. Today, we are checking out something that was one of the most iconic models that Lionel produced in the late 90s. This right here is the Commodore Vanderbilt New York Central Streamlined Hudson. Let's check it out. So during the 1990s was a very interesting time for Lionel. This saw the complete turning of the tide and the changing of the times for the company. Prior to this, in the late 70s and early 80s, Lionel just genuinely was not doing very well as a company. They were still producing trains, and there were some really cool sets that came out during that particular time period. Sets such as the MPC era, which saw very, very interesting and very cool sets like the Blue Comet, the Southern Crescent, the Alton Limited, the J set, very, very cool sets. But the MPC era back in those days wasn't very well liked as MPC is like today. So by the time that the fellow of the name of Richard Kuhn came around and purchased the company, he had the full intention to revitalize the company and start appealing to more of a higher scale collector's market than just necessarily focusing on the whole idea of toy trains. So we saw the first real shift in the hobby as far as seeing fully scale model trains from Lionel. So this would include dozens of locomotives over this time period. Engines like the Yellow Belly Hudson from the Chesapeake in Ohio, number 490, very iconic locomotive. That's an engine I would really like to have at some point. That's a beautiful train. That's an engine that's still preserved at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. And we have this engine here, which is the Commodore Vanderbilt, which is a very beautiful streamlined Hudson. This was the first streamlined Hudson. This predates the Dreyfuss Hudson. We're going to get into the history in just a minute. We also saw engines like the first time that Lionel introduced the Big Boy and the Mohawk and the Class A. All these iconic engines from back in the day. And Lionel was starting to push the boundaries. And this also was the introduction in the 90s of TMCC, or Trainmaster Command Control. So this was when Neil Young came in and introduced Lion Tech, and him and Richard Kuhn and a bunch of other guys started to develop and create the control system that would later lead on to Lionel Legacy that we know today. But this was, to me, one of the pinnacle locomotives of the late 90s. And this is really cool because this engine came out around 1996. So this was on the catalog cover the year I was born. So right away, this was an engine I absolutely been wanting to own for years. It's crazy to think that this model here is 27 years old and it still looks really, really good here on the layout. So enough of the history about the model and the era that it came out from. Let's talk about the actual history of the train. Alright, so the story goes, as far as the history of the Commodore Vanderbilt, we got to go all the way back to the very end of the 20s, going into the very early 30s. So this was constructed around 1934. is when the Vanderbilt was put into service. Back in those days, this was a time where railroading was starting to get a little bit competitive with the roadways and automobiles and stuff like that. And the railroad was trying to revamp itself to get more attention and more ridership back in those days. Obviously, during the time of the Great Depression, trains were becoming very, very expensive to ride on, and certain passenger fares were just out of the question for certain people. But back in those days, New York Central was trying to get more people to still ride. So to do that, they decided to take one of their locomotives. They're one of the most iconic engines of their railroad, the Hudson locomotive, and they decided to do a new concept that was becoming very popular and becoming quite a trend in the 30s, the Art Deco streamlined style, the futuristic style. And this was the very first attempt New York Central did at something like this to one of their locomotives. And you will note some elements on the engine. It does have the skull and disc drivers, which is very iconic to the Dreyfuss Hudsons. So this engine was the very first locomotive that actually pulled the 20th Century Limited, one of the most, if not the most iconic trains that New York Central ever developed and created. This was the earliest rendition of that train. But back in the day, there were no streamlined passenger cars to go with the locomotive. So back in the day, this particular engine would pull green Pullman cars, just standard coach cars that the railroad had. But the engine that was heading it up was this. It is this beautiful silver color, which I will now tell you guys that this color on this particular model is incorrect. So when this engine was actually released, it stirred up quite a lot of controversy back in the day, for the sake that this engine was not painted the right way that the Vanderbilt was painted in service. So there were some very early photographs that came up around the time that this engine was made, suggesting that the engine was this brightish silver, when in actuality the only thing that was actually silver on the model and on the actual prototype was the inside of the cab. So the cab was this bright silver that we all see here, but the entire outside was this very dark, almost very much blackish gray color, with some white pinstriping to go along the side of the engine and other parts of the locomotive. Outside of that, this engine, technically speaking, is very much fantasy, the way it's painted. But to me, that's what makes this engine so iconic. Most people remember the Commodore Vanderbilt painted up like this when they think about this model from the 90s, and I actually personally really like it. It's got this very striking appearance to it, and I actually like that the Commodore Vanderbilt in New York Central that's found on the side of the engine and on the tender is actually a brighter silver, so you got this two-tone color going on, so it really pops out at you, and it's just beautiful. The engine itself was in service for a few years until they decided to eventually develop and create the Dreyfuss Hudsons that we know to this day. So this engine was not around very long. I believe it was only in service from 1934 to around 1936 or 37 before they eventually replaced it with the 20th century that we all know and love. But there you go. There's the entire history of this train. Let's take a really close-up look at the model real fast, and then we'll zip this around the layout. So real quick, I do want to show you guys the packaging for the Commodore Vanderbilt here. This is just something that is beyond 1990s to me, and this is showing that Lionel back in the day was still trying to capture that classic look of the post-war days of old, but wanted to do something a little modern here. So the front of the box, what I just showed you actually was the rear of the box. This is the front, so you get that classic orange look that we all know and love. Number 777. This engine is number 6-18045. You got New York Central Commodore Vanderbilt. But the back here is really cool. This is actually the catalog cover for the 1996 issue. But this is one of the very last catalog cover arts that I think we got before Lionel started to change over to just doing digital renderings and things like that. If you haven't looked at any of the catalogs from the 90s, this is more or less what a lot of them look like, and this is super cool, and I really wish we could go back to this style. I don't think we ever will, but it's clearly showing a changing of the times back in the day, and this is just a striking image. This is one of my favorite catalog covers of all time. This is just a beautiful, dramatic shot of the Vanderbilt coming over this trestle bridge here, and just really, really beautiful, capturing the majestic kind of feel that is this streamliner. Just some really, really cool box art. But now let's get on to the actual model real fast. Alright, so real quick, here we are trackside with the Vanderbilt. And what else can I really say? This is just a beautiful streamliner. This is just such a very unique design. They dubbed this the bathtub design. So basically a lot of railroad enthusiasts and fan of this locomotive like to dub this the upside down bathtub. And technically, if you were to flip this upside down, and this arch does kind of give that rough appearance of something like that. I think that's a little ridiculous, but it's what some people call it, and hey, you know, the nickname kind of stuck for the design. But I think this is just such a really beautiful design. It's super simplistic. There isn't really much detail I'm going to go over here because streamliners, referably speaking, they don't really have that much detail from a model perspective. But you're mostly paying for the fact that you're getting this beautiful streamlined appearance. But some of the detail that is present is really cool. I love that you get to see the exposed running gear, which is really cool. There's those skull and disc driver wheels I was discussing earlier. These are the same type of wheels you would see on the 20th Century Limited Dreyfuss locomotive. But you have this nice rim, this like silver rims on the wheels there, and you get them on the pilot trucks as well, and even you see them on the tender truck too, which is really cool. You get the nice Commodore Vanderbilt here on the side. You don't get a number here on the side of the cab, which I think that's only on this silver version. I think on some of the other models they do have the proper cab number, which is neat. You get the really cool 3D image New York Central badge here, which is really neat. And then when you go to the top of the cab, you get, and that's the top of the engine, that's where you get the vast majority of the detail, which is really cool. So you get this grill detail that's here, and I'm going to put images on screen of a panning shot of all the detail on this. It's absolutely phenomenal. You get the exposed bell, which is really cool. You get the pop-off valves on the top of the engine. But that grill detail on the top where the smokestack is really impressive and really cool to see that. As well as the tender too. The tender has a very interesting detail because that is where the coal load is hidden, but there is no coal load. You get a reveal of the master controls for the engine and where you would put your 9-volt battery if you're running this in conventional. But very, very cool design. I love the look of the tender. The tender is very interesting. It's just this very big and curvy design over the famous typical tender that we all know. But just a beautiful overall looking design. I really love this thing. But yeah, guys, that's going to wrap up as far as the history and some of the information about the model and some of the details here. Without further ado, let's fire this thing up and run it around the layout. So one thing I love about these older TMCC engines is that they're backwards compatible with the LC2 Cab 2 remote, which is really nice. But I want to show you guys how this sounds when you first fire it up, because the whistle on this model is quite possibly one of my all-time favorites from anything Lionel has produced over the years. That is awesome. Let's send her out, and I'll see you guys at the end of the video. hope you guys enjoyed this throwback to the 1990s and checking out, to me, one of Lionel's very best from that particular era. This is just an absolutely amazing model, and definitely one of my all-time favorite New York Central locomotives by far. And Lionel put a lot of work into this engine, and some of the stories behind this particular engine and all the other engines from the 1990s were very, very exciting. And this was definitely a dream engine of mine as a kid, and I'm so thrilled and excited to finally own one of these. And definitely really hope that Lionel in the near future decides to re-release this with Lionel Legacy. This would be an absolute slam dunk, home run, all 9 yards. This would be an amazing re-release, and I really hope we see it in the next couple of years. But that being said, I think we're going to wrap this video up. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. I'm Matty C, and I'll see you in the next one.